They say that what we wear does not define who we are, but in a world that judges quickly and speaks loudly, it is often the first thing people notice. And on a crowded flight from New York to London, a middle-aged woman in a worn-out leather jacket was about to learn just how cruel that judgment could be. Her name was Sarah Jenkins. She boarded the plane with a small, scuffed bag and took her seat in economy class. She had kind eyes, but they were tired. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and her face bore the lines of a life lived fully, but not always easily. She settled into her window seat, pulled out a worn novel, and tried to disappear into its pages. But the people around her would not let her disappear. A group of sharply dressed businessmen and women sat nearby, fresh from a corporate conference. They were loud and confident and smelled of expensive cologne and privilege. As Sarah walked past them to use the restroom earlier, one of the men, a tall blond man named Derek, had snickered at her jacket. "Looks like someone raided a thrift store from 1985, he whispered to his colleagues, loud enough for others to hear. A few of them laughed. Sarah ignored it. She had heard worse. As the flight attendants began the safety demonstration, Sarah's eyes scanned the cabin with a focus that was unusual. She wasn't looking for a drink or a pillow. She was looking at the exits, the emergency equipment, the layout of the plane. It was an instinct she could never shake, no matter how many years had passed. Derek, now bored, started making comments again. "Hey, Grandma," he called out to her from across the aisle. "You know that book won't save you if we go down, right? Maybe you should have bought a life jacket instead of that jacket." His colleagues erupted in laughter again. A few other passengers looked over, some with mild disgust at Derek's behavior, others with awkward smiles. A flight attendant, a young man named Michael, noticed the disturbance and walked over. "Sir, please keep your voice down," Michael said politely. "Oh, we're just having fun," Derek said, waving him off. "She doesn't mind. Do you, ma'am?" Sarah looked up from her book. Her eyes met Derek's. There was no anger in them, just a calm, steady gaze that made Derek feel for a moment inexplicably small. She said nothing and returned to her book. Derek, feeling the need to reassert his dominance, turned to his friends. "Probably doesn't even understand English. I'm probably going to visit her son in prison or something." The bullying continued for the next hour. Every time a flight attendant passed, the group would make snide remarks about the service, comparing it to the private jets they usually flew on. But Sarah remained their main target. They mocked her cheap shoes, her simple request for water instead of champagne, the way she quietly thanked the staff. Then, about 4 hours into the flight, everything changed. The plane gave a sudden, violent lurch. Drinks spilled. A woman screamed. The seatbelt sign flashed on, accompanied by an urgent chime. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but with an edge of tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please return to your seats immediately and fasten your seatbelts." But it wasn't turbulence. The plane dropped again, this time a stomach-churning freefall that lasted several seconds. Oxygen masks deployed from the ceiling with a loud pop. Panic erupted. People were crying, praying, clutching each other. Derek and his friends, their bravado gone, were pale and silent, gripping their armrests with white-knuckled terror. The flight attendants rushed through the aisles, trying to calm everyone, but their faces betrayed their own fear. Something was seriously wrong. The engines were making a grinding, sputtering sound. The cabin lights flickered and died, leaving only the dim glow of the emergency lights. Michael, the flight attendant, was trying to reach the cockpit when the intercom crackled again. This time, it was the pilot, his voice strained. "This is the captain. We have a critical situation. All right, we've lost one engine and are experiencing severe hydraulic failure. I need everyone to remain calm and brace for a possible emergency landing." A new wave of terror washed over the cabin. A possible emergency landing. In the middle of the Atlantic, people began to hyperventilate. A child was crying for his mother. The atmosphere was thick with fear. Then the cockpit door opened. Everyone expected to see the captain or first officer. Instead, a young, flustered-looking flight attendant stepped out. She scanned the cabin, her eyes wide with panic. Is there a doctor on board? She shouted. Any medical personnel? No one answered. People were too scared to speak. She tried again, her voice trembling. Is there anyone with any kind of technical or aviation experience? Silence, and then a calm, steady voice cut through the chaos. I can help. Everyone turned. It was Sarah, the woman in the worn-out leather jacket. She was already unbuckling her seatbelt and standing up, her posture straight, her eyes clear and focused. The transformation was startling. She no longer looked like a tired, ordinary woman. She looked like someone in complete command. The flight attendant stared at her. Ma'am, please sit down. It's not safe. I said I can help, Sarah repeated, walking towards her. Her voice was not loud, but it carried a weight of authority that silenced the cabin. I need to get to the cockpit, now. Derek from his seat managed a weak, sarcastic laugh. Oh, great, the thrift store grandma is going to save us. This is a joke. This is how we die. Sarah ignored him completely. Then she reached the flight attendant and spoke in a low, firm tone. Your captain just lost hydraulics at 35,000 feet. That's not just an engine failure. That's a control surface failure. He's fighting the yoke right now. He needs help. I'm not a doctor. I'm a pilot. Now, are you going to take me to him, or do I have to open that door myself? The flight attendant, stunned, simply nodded and led her to the cockpit door. She knocked, spoke quickly, and the door opened just enough for Sarah to slip inside. The cabin was dead silent. Everyone was looking at the closed cockpit door. The only sounds were the groaning of the airframe and the terrified sobs of a few passengers. Inside the cockpit, the scene was one of controlled chaos. The captain, a grizzled veteran named Captain Lewis, was wrestling with the control yoke, a sweat pouring down his face. The first officer was frantically flipping through emergency checklists, his hands shaking. We're losing altitude too fast, the first officer yelled. I can't get the flaps to respond. Captain Lewis looked up as Sarah entered. Who the hell are you? Get out! This is a restricted area. I'm a pilot, Sarah said, her voice calm but urgent. She moved past him and looked at the instrument panel. Her eyes scanned the screens rapidly, taking in a dozen different readings at once. You've got a dual hydraulic failure. Both systems, A and B, are critical. Your right engine is flamed out. You're trying to manually override the stabilizer trim, but it's not responding because the jack screw is jammed. Captain Lewis stared at her. He hadn't even mentioned the stabilizer trim problem yet. How could she possibly know that, just by looking at the panel? Who are you? He whispered. My name is Sarah Jenkins, she said, not taking her eyes off the instruments. I flew F-14 for the Navy for 15 years. I've landed on carriers in storms and brought back planes with more holes than Swiss cheese. Right now your plane is telling me you have about 12 minutes before you're in the water. So, let's work together and save these people. The first officer's jaw dropped. Captain Lewis, after a second of shock, nodded. All right, what do you suggest? For the next 10 minutes, the three of them worked in perfect coordination. Sarah's experience with high-stress, high-G maneuvers and emergency situations was invaluable. She knew exactly how to coax the last bit of performance out of a dying machine. She guided the first officer through a series of backup procedures that he had only ever read about in manuals. She helped Captain Lewis adjust his approach, using differential thrust from the remaining engine to compensate for the failed hydraulics. In the cabin, the passengers sat in terrified silence. They could feel the plane shuddering, dropping, then leveling off slightly. They heard the roar of the single engine spooling up and down. They had no idea what was happening, but they could feel the struggle. Derek sat in his seat, his earlier arrogance completely gone. He was trembling, his face ashen. He kept staring at the cockpit door, the door that the grandma had walked through. He thought about all the cruel things he had said. He felt a shame so deep it was physical. Then, the captain's voice came over the intercom. It was tired, but calm. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain. I want to inform you that we have managed to stabilize the aircraft. We have received permission for an emergency landing at a military airfield in Ireland. We are beginning our descent now. Please remain in your seats and follow the instructions of the flight attendants. I want to give a special thank you to a passenger who came to our aid. Without her, this might have been a very different story. A collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. People hugged each other, cried, held hands. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, checking seatbelts and offering words of comfort. 20 minutes later, the plane touched down on the runway of a remote Irish airfield. It was a rough landing, but it was safe. Emergency vehicles raced alongside the plane as it came to a stop. When the doors finally opened and the passengers began to disembark onto the tarmac, they were met by a cool, damp breeze and the flashing lights of ambulances and fire trucks. As the passengers gathered on the tarmac, waiting to be taken to the terminal, they saw Captain Lewis and his first officer emerge from the plane. Behind them, looking tired but composed, was Sarah. Captain Lewis shook her hand warmly, a look of profound gratitude on his face. "Sarah Jenkins," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "you are a hero. You saved this plane and everyone on it." The passengers erupted in applause. They crowded around her, thanking her, patting her on the back. She smiled modestly, a little embarrassed by the attention. And then, through the crowd, came Derek. He was alone. His colleagues hung back, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Derek walked up to Sarah, his head bowed. When he looked up, there were tears in his eyes. "Ma'am," he began, his voice cracking. I am so sorry. I said terrible things to you. I mocked you. I made fun of your jacket, of you. I was an arrogant, stupid fool. And then you saved our lives. You saved my life. I don't know how to ever thank you or how to apologize enough." Sarah looked at him. She studied his face, saw the genuine remorse, the shame, the humility. She reached up and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Derek, isn't it?" she said softly. He nodded, surprised she remembered his name. Sarah smiled gently. "You know this jacket?" she said, looking down at her worn leather jacket. "I've had it for 30 years. I bought it when I was a young pilot, and fresh out of flight school. I wore it on every mission. It's been through a lot. It reminds me that what you look like on the outside doesn't matter. It's what you're made of on the inside that counts." Derek sobbed, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry." "I know you are," Sarah said, "and it's okay. We all make mistakes. The important thing is that we learn from them. You're alive. You have a chance to be better. Don't waste it." She gave his shoulder a final pat and then walked away, escorted by a uniformed officer towards the terminal. Derek watched her go, the lesson of his life burning itself into his soul. The story of Flight 372 spread quickly. News reporters tried to interview Sarah, but she declined most requests. She wasn't interested in fame. She was just a pilot who did what she was trained to do. But for the passengers on that flight, she was more than a pilot. She was a symbol of quiet strength, of dignity, of the incredible power of humility. They had ridiculed a woman for her appearance, and in doing so had learned that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear worn-out leather jackets and carry the quiet confidence of a life lived with purpose. Years later, Derek would tell this story to his children and grandchildren. He would tell them about the day he learned that you can never judge a person by their cover, and that the most extraordinary people are often the ones who walk among us unnoticed, ready to step forward when they are needed most. And he would always end the story the same way, with a tear in his eye and a simple, heartfelt wish that everyone could meet a Sarah Jenkins at least once in their life.